Welcome to the Office of Public School Construction's virtual training on converting your charter school facilities program preliminary apportionment. My name is Erin Canine. I am the program analyst responsible for the charter school facilities program. Today's agenda is going to cover first a recap of the last funding round, Proposition 51. We're going to go over how to convert your preliminary apportionment, some funding restrictions that you might encounter when you convert, how to access funding, financial reporting requirements, how to submit documents to OPSC, as well as some important tips and resources. So the Proposition 51 funding round was provided $500 million in Prop 51. When we processed the round, the board decided to leave the round open so that any additional bond authority that returned through 2018 could also be used to fund additional preliminary apportionments. Because of that additional bond authority that came back, we ended up funding approximately $650 million and awarded about 62 preliminary apportionments. Now, those are individual apportionments, not necessarily 62 projects. Of those preliminary apportionments, 16 can still request advance funding. Advance funding is an optional funding that you can receive that provides assistance for design costs or site acquisition costs if that was reserved with your preliminary apportionment. Of the 62 PAs, we still have 47 that need to convert their preliminary apportionment to a final apportionment. So converting, what does that mean? That basically is submitting a complete and valid application for funding, Form SAB 5004. And what that form is going to do is it is going to take your preliminary proposed project to an actual project with approved plans. At conversion, keep in mind there are a couple of things you can do. You can request less funding than you originally reserved. You may have decided that the project you were going to go forward with is a little too big and you want to reduce that. You can also request eligible supplemental grants that you did not reserve previously. This would be something like maybe you were intending to construct a one-story classroom facility, but now you're going to construct a multi-level two-story facility. You can request that multi-level supplemental grant with your new construction project if you didn't reserve it before. You can also receive additional funding beyond what was reserved for you. If your project qualifies for the additional funding, you can be found financially sound for the additional funding, and we have available bond authority to fund you beyond what we reserved. The Form SAB 5004 that you will use to convert your project, along with all other SAB forms that I'm going to be mentioning in this presentation, can be accessed from our website under Forms. So the supporting documents that you need to have with your Form SAB 5004 to make it a complete and valid submittal are for all project types, your final Division of the State Architect approved plans and specifications, along with the final plan approval letters from DSA and the California Department of Education, your Career Tech certification letter, and also a current request for a financial soundness review from the California School Finance Authority. Now, that last item, technically there isn't a document that you will submit with our application, but you will submit that request to CSFA at the same time you submit your conversion application to us. You need to have a current financial soundness determination as of the date that we take you to our board to approve your conversion application. So don't submit any of these documents to us for the financial soundness review. All of those documents will go to CSFA. Now, if you have a new construction project, a few other additional items that you will need to submit is a site development worksheet, off-site plans that have been approved by the local authority. And then if your project consists of site acquisition, you'll also need your final CDE site approval letter, a valid opening or closing escrow statement, an appraisal with a valuation date that is within 6 months of when we receive your application, because your site acquisition funding is based on the lesser of that appraised value or what you pay for the site. And then any DTSC and hazardous waste removal invoices if you are requesting those costs. The site development worksheet is used to request additional funding for service site, off-site, and utilities. We provide funding based on what is allowed in School Facility Program Regulation Section 1859.76. This worksheet is broken out into sections that align perfectly with the regulation sections here. Some key points about filling out this site development worksheet is that you'll need to make sure you are not requesting funding that isn't allowed in regulation if it specifically states it's not allowed, that you aren't reporting lump sums, and that you are using the current Sierra West construction cost numbers for the year that you're submitting this form. The site development worksheet is located on our website in the OPSC online program under resources. Now I'm going to touch more on OPSC online later, but you can either access the form there, again, under the resources tab, or you can also contact me, and my contact information is at the end of this presentation, and I can email a site development worksheet to you. If you have a rehabilitation project, the additional item that you'll need to submit is a cost estimate that breaks out all of the total hard construction costs in the rehabilitation project. Now, this is a format that you can pick yourself. We do not have a template for this like we do for site development. What we're going to use this for is we're going to review all of the hard construction work and make sure that it is allowable under rehabilitation. And we'll also use this to make sure that the project meets the 60% commensurate requirement. I'm going to touch on that requirement in a few slides. One other item that you may need to submit is the Access Fire Code Requirements DSA checklist. I say you may need to submit this because funding for this work can be requested in two ways. You can either request 3% of your base grant, and if you do that, you do not need to submit a checklist. But if you are going to have a project with a large amount of access and fire code work, you may have costs that are going to exceed that 3%, in which case you can fill out this checklist. It's a DSA, Division of the State Architect checklist, and submit it to DSA when you are submitting your plan. So it must be reviewed and approved by DSA when your plans are approved. The key thing here is the work that we fund is the minimum work that is required by DSA. So even using this checklist, your work could possibly go beyond the funding that is provided for that particular work. So converting your PA, there is a deadline to when all of this needs to be completed. It's 4 years from the date that your preliminary apportionment was awarded. Now, what needs to be done by that 4-year deadline is just submitting that complete and valid 5004. You do not need to start construction. There is a one-time 1-year extension that you can request, and as long as it meets all of the requirements in regulation, it will be approved as a consent item. That request for the extension must be submitted prior to your deadline, or you convert prior to your deadline. But beyond that one-time 1-year extension, there are no other additional extensions that we can provide. Our executive officer does have emergency powers to allow us to provide extensions to deadlines. For example, if we are reviewing an application and request additional documentation from you and give you a deadline of 15 days, we may be able to extend those deadlines if it's due to COVID. But the 4-year conversion deadline is a requirement in statute, and so our executive officer's emergency powers do not extend to that. So keep in mind when you are converting that there are some funding restrictions that you might come across. One of them is that 60% commensurate requirement that I mentioned previously. This is a requirement that 60% of the total funding, less anything provided for site acquisition, that you receive from us is spent on hard construction costs versus soft costs. We are going to verify this at conversion, and we will also verify this at final fund release and closeout. You could also be restricted for the amount of funding you receive due to your financial soundness determination. If you qualify for, let's say, a $10 million project that can only be found financially sound for $8 million, that's all we'll be able to fund you. Also, based on the available bond authority, if you say qualify for more, for a higher total project cost than what we originally reserved for you, if we don't have the available bond authority to fund beyond your original reservation, then you'll be capped at either what we have or that original reservation. For rehab projects, there are two other conditions that could possibly restrict your funding. One of them is the capacity of your rehabilitation project. What we do, and we did this when we calculated your preliminary apportionment reservation, we'll do it again when you convert, is we first calculate a rehabilitation base grant, which is based on the square footage that you reserved in your preliminary apportionment. But then we also calculate what a new construction base grant would be for that rehab project as well, based on the number of classrooms and the grade level of those classrooms in the project. If the new construction base grant is less, then this project will be capped at that amount. You'll see a cap like this happen in projects that are not only rehabilitating classrooms, but a lot of other facilities as well, such as an admin, gym, and a multi-purpose room. And then also a funding restriction may be applied to your project if you are including demolition and replacement of like kind, or if you are reconfiguring existing facilities. If you demolish a certain amount of square footage and then you build back more square footage than what you demolished, or if you build back more classrooms than were demolished, that excess square footage and classrooms are going to be looked at as new construction because it is adding capacity to your site or it's adding square footage to your site. Those costs will need to be funded either privately because they're ineligible for rehabilitation funding, or they can be funded by a corresponding new construction project. Likewise, if you reconfigure a facility, let's say you have a very large classroom and you add a wall to break it into 2 classrooms, but your square footage remains the same, you are still adding capacity to the site. So we will now see a site with 2 classrooms versus 1, and that extra classroom will also need to either be privately funded or funded by a corresponding new construction project. And then lastly, for new construction projects, we do have a rule with occupancy. If you are able to start your project prior to submitting a conversion application, you want to make sure you just do not occupy the classrooms for a new construction project prior to submitting that form SAB 5004. Once you do occupy, then the project is not eligible for funding under new construction, but this does not apply to rehabilitation. So now we've covered converting your project, I want to touch on how to access funding. So there are, I guess, up to 3 times that you could access funding. One would be to access design funds. 2 would be to access site acquisition funds if you reserve those. And then lastly, to access your construction funding. This process I'm going to go over is the same for all of those. There are a few nuances at the end that I will touch on. So the first step to accessing your funding is you need to have an unfunded approval on the unfunded list lack of AB 55 loans. That's the actual name of the unfunded list. What this means is your particular funding phase, whether it be a design advance or your full construction funding, has bond authority approved for it. It just needs cash. The advances were placed on this list when your preliminary apportionment was awarded. Your construction funding or your adjusted grant funding will be placed on this list when your conversion application is approved by the State Allocation Board. This is what the list looks like. It is updated and published monthly in our agenda for our State Allocation Board meetings. At the end of this presentation, I provide a link to take you to the page on our website where you can either see the next meeting coming up and the agenda published for that or archived agendas. The way that projects are listed on this list is in date order based on when the State Allocation Board approved them, with the exception of life and safety projects. Those get pushed up to the top regardless of when they are approved by the board. So the next step after having an unfunded approval is to submit a certification. The certification is basically the applicant certifying that they will be able to meet the requirements to request the funds by a specific deadline. And those deadlines are specific to your type of funding. We have certification rounds twice a year. They always open the second Wednesday in May and the second Wednesday in November, and then remain open for 30 days. If you certify in a May certification round and a May-June certification round, you are eligible for funding that becomes available between July 1 to December 31st of that year. If you certify in a November-December certification round, then you are eligible to receive funding that becomes available between January 1 and June 30th of the following year. We have templates that you can use to certify, and we also have all of our future upcoming certification rounds advertised on our website under resources and priority funding for school construction projects. For the templates, there are two that you can use. There is a template for requesting advance funding, and there is a template for requesting your funding after conversion, which is your adjusted grant funding. You can use one letter for multiple projects as long as they're the same phase, either advance or your adjusted grant. Once you've certified, the next thing you will do is wait for funds to become available. This is generally from a spring or fall general obligation bond sale. It's important to keep in mind that where we generally and historically have had these sales in spring and fall, they are never guaranteed, and they also need to include funding for the school facility program. Bond sales are advertised on the Treasurer's office under bond financing. You will see on this schedule, we had a general obligation bond sale that opened on March 11th, and we anticipate funding eligible projects from this sale at our upcoming April State Allocation Board. Once we receive funds from a bond sale, the next thing we do is take you back to the board, and we will, like I mentioned, we'll be doing in April, and we change your approval from unfunded to funded. You then have 90 days for either design or your construction funding, or 180 days if you're asking for site acquisition from that board date where we changed you from unfunded to funded to request your funds. Once you submit your fund release request, it generally takes about 6 weeks for you to receive your funds. So to request your funds, you will submit a fund release request form SAB 5005 and the supporting documents. All projects need to have an executed grant agreement. This is a document that is created by us, and it is specific to the funding phase. So for example, if you were asking for design funding right now, you'll have a design grant agreement, and then down the road when you ask for your adjusted grant construction funding, you'll have a different agreement for that. You also need to execute your charter school agreements. These are agreements that are just specific to the charter school facilities program. All projects will have a memorandum of understanding, and if you are taking a loan for your match, you will have a funding agreement. Both of those forms are created by the California School Finance Authority. If the district holds title to the project, you'll also have a use agreement, and the district is responsible for creating that. Now, these are not specific to the funding phase, so once you execute these, let's say to request design funding, you don't need to execute them again to request your construction funding. So some additional items for requesting your advance funding. So this would be for design or site advance. You have to have a current financial soundness determination from CSFA. If you are requesting site advance, you also need to have a CDE contingent site approval letter, a preliminary appraisal, an updated application form SAB 5009, and then additional items if a charter holds title, such as a recorded lien for the total amount of funds you'll be receiving for your advance, and CC&Rs. If this is your final fund release, so this is your construction money after you've converted, you don't have to have a current financial soundness review. That review that you received the day that you were approved, or that you had to have by the day that you were approved by the State Allocation Board, is the last one that you'll need. You won't need another one to access your funds, but you will need to submit your full contracts, because the requirement to request funds for your construction funding is that you're in contract for at least 50% of your hard construction costs. You'll submit your notices to proceed, and you'll submit a project information worksheet. This is also located on our website, and it's only for new construction projects. Rehabilitation projects do not need to submit this. And then there are additional items. We update if you hold title to your project, if a charter school holds title to the project, we will update the lien so that it is now for the full amount of funding that the charter school will be receiving from the state. So I mentioned that this whole process is the same for accessing funds, whether you are accessing design, site, or new construction, but that there was one little nuance, and this is it. There are non-participation occurrences that you can receive at the construction funding phase. This does not apply to your advanced funding for design and site. But once you convert and you are on the unfunded list for your adjusted grant, anytime you do not participate in a certification round, or if you do participate but fail to make that 90-day deadline to request your funds, you receive a non-participation occurrence. After 2 of these, the project is permanently rescinded and is no longer eligible for funding. Again, remember, this does not apply to your advanced funding for design and site. This is only for your construction funding phase. So after you convert and you receive your funding, there are some financial reporting requirements that we require. The first is 1 year after you receive that final construction funding, you are going to need to begin to submit annual expenditure reports. This is the form SAB 5006, and included with it, you need to submit a detailed listing of project expenditures. These both are also located on our website under forms. And you do submit these a year after you receive your final construction funding, and then every year after until your project is complete. We consider a project complete when either you submit a 5006 indicating the project is 100% complete, or 3 years have passed from that final fund release for an elementary school, or 4 years from a middle or high school. This is what the detailed listing of project expenditures looks like. Key thing on here is you're not going to want to, just like with the site development, don't enter lump sums. You'll need to itemize everything out. You are going to want to make sure that you are saving your documentation to support all of these expenditures. It's going to be very important that you keep good records. The other thing that you're going to be required to do after your final fund release is demonstrate that you are making substantial progress on the completion of your project. You will submit this form, which is also located on our website, 18 months after you receive your final fund release. One thing I want to point out about this form is when you look at it, you will notice that there is an option to select substantial progress after design or site. That does not apply to charter school facilities program projects. That only applies to SFP, new construction mod projects, and other projects under the SFP, but not the charter school facilities program. CSFP projects only need to do substantial progress after final fund release. Once you complete that project, which again, remember is 100% reported on a 5006, or the 3 or 4 year timeline hits, you need to have a K12 expenditure audit completed by a local auditor within 1 year of that project completion. They are going to review your expenditures to determine if they are eligible or ineligible. It's important to keep in mind that ineligible expenditures and savings will need to be returned, and the applicant is penalized for reporting ineligible expenditures on the form. You can request a pre-review from our office prior to submitting your 5006 with 100% reported, or prior to that 3 to 4 year deadline being hit, and we can review it to see if there are anything that stands out as being ineligible. But once you submit that 5006 that has 100% reported, or the 3 or 4 year timeline hits, that pre-review cannot be requested. Some things that'll really help out with tracking your expenditures is make sure that you separate your funding into a separate account or sub-account, so that way you can clearly keep your expenditures separate from your general charter school expenditures. More information on the K-12 audit can be found on our website under resources. There is information on there that your local auditor will use, and there is also a virtual training just like this one that was given previously this year. Lastly, if you have taken a loan for your match, payments on that loan need to begin 1 year after you occupy the project. It is very important that applicants notify the OPSC when you occupy so that we can request a payment schedule from the California School Finance Authority. The schedules can be up to 30 years to repay, and they are 9-month schedules with no payments collected in June, July, or February. This is because the payments are collected by intercepting your average daily attendance payment that you receive from CDE. So submitting documents to OPSC has changed a little bit now that everybody is predominantly working from home or teleworking a majority of the time. Whereas before everything had to be submitted in hard copy, you now can submit either by email or by using our OPSC online system. If you submit by email, you'll submit all of your documents to our application review team. The email is provided there, and you will also CC me. There is one exception to that. If you are submitting a priority funding certification letter, you will still submit to those 2 addresses, but you will also CC Haley Jensen. So OPSC Online is our new paperless system that allows you to submit applications, update contact information, submit certifications. The only thing you can't, or priority funding certifications, the only thing you can't do on this on OPSC Online is request a deadline extension for your conversion deadline. Information, a user guide on how to access OPSC Online, as well as the link to access it, is located on our website under resources. You will need to create an ID to log in, and information on how to do that is in the user guide. So some important tips to leave you with. Those charter school agreements that you need to have executed in order to request your funding, those are going to need to be signed by the school district as well. So this would be if the district holds title, they need to sign your MOU, and then you also need to get into a facility use agreement with them. Make sure you start working on them as soon as possible, because you don't only have your timeline to think about, but also your districts, and you don't want to miss that deadline to request your funds. Don't forget that certain variances are allowed between your preliminary project scope and your final project scope. You should discuss these with us early, so that way we can help you determine if they are eligible or if they might affect your funding. Remember, do not occupy new construction projects prior to submitting that Form SAB 5004. Otherwise, you'll be ineligible for funding, and that does not apply to rehabilitation projects. For your construction delivery method, it is the responsibility of the applicant to determine with their legal counsel what method to use, but we have determined that charter schools may not use a lease-back construction delivery method. At this point, districts may use this construction delivery method. So if the district is the applicant or managing the project and the one entering, into the lease back that is allowed. However, charter schools may not enter into a lease back. Don't forget, this is a public works project since you are bond funded. So you are going to need to follow all labor code, public contract code, and government code requirements. You certify to all of these on the form SAB 5004 when you are signing them, and on other forms as well. So make sure you are reading those certifications so you are aware of the requirements that you are expected to follow. And then lastly, don't forget about requesting that closeout pre-review if you have any concerns about any costs being reported on that detailed listing of project expenditures being ineligible. And keep in mind that that request needs to be before you submit a 100% complete 5006 or that 3 or 4 year timeline runs out. Here are some links to important resources, including the link to where the agendas can be found that I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation. There's also a link to the K12 audit page, and also a link to the Treasurer's office where you can see the advertised bond sales. Lastly, I wanted to let you know about an email subscription list that is specific just to charter schools. If you would like to access it, you can follow this link, and then you will receive any email blasts that our office sends out that is specific to the Charter School Facilities Program. Going forward, if you have any questions about the program, about this presentation, or anything Charter School Facilities Program related, you can contact myself. I am the lead program analyst, or you can contact Barbara Kampmeinert. And with that, that concludes OPSC's presentation of converting your charter school facilities preliminary apportionment.